What's up, Sugar High? It's PA David, and it's time for another episode of Answering Your Questions. If you're new here, welcome. And just so that you know what this is all about, I'm a certified diabetes specialty PA, and I practice in Southern California. And Sugar High is a channel that's meant to bring you guys diabetes information that's reliable and in a format that's both kind of understandable and relatable. I'm just kind of a normal guy who happens to practice medicine for a living, and I like to keep it as casual as that. So today's a nice warm morning in summer, and I do have to go to work today, but I ain't going anywhere until I've had this morning coffee. So I thought I'd have it with you guys and see if we could get some of your questions answered. For these Answering Your Questions videos, I like collecting some of the additional questions that you guys have brought up in the comments section of my videos, and I like to elaborate on them here because you guys come up with some really great questions, and it gives us an opportunity to kind of chat together and go over some of the details that maybe I didn't think to bring up when covering a topic in a previous video. So this Answering Your Questions video is kind of a GLP-1 special edition because all of the questions that we're going to do today have all come from the videos that I posted on GLP-1 medications. I made a video covering GLP-1 medications in general, and more recently I posted one that's kind of a full review on Trulicity specifically. And more of those are coming, by the way, so if you're looking for a review on Ozempic or Bydureon, Victoza, or Rybelsus, those are on the way. And if it's any later than August or September of 2020 when you happen to be watching this video, chances are that those specific reviews have already been posted, so go ahead and check the other videos on my channel if you're looking for one of those in particular. So let's get started on this edition of Sugar High Answering Your Questions. Okay, so our first question comes from a subscriber, Michelle, and it's actually kind of a two-part question. In the Trulicity video, I went over some of the common side effects of Trulicity and compared them to some of the other medications in the same family in order to kind of give some context and help you understand that medication in comparison with all the other ones. So this question has to do with some of the common side effects of nausea and weight loss. And she wants to know if the nausea that these medications cause might be the actual cause of the weight loss that oftentimes comes with the medications. So that's a really good question because it makes sense, right? Because if you're nauseated all the time, you're not going to want to eat, right? If you eat less, you're likely to lose some weight. So I think that that contributes to it for sure. But even in people who don't get nausea with these medications, and even when they stick it out to the point where the nausea starts to subside, the decreased appetite that comes with the medications can happen even without nausea, and even can last after the nausea subsides. So the nausea usually doesn't last forever, and if it does, we're not going to keep somebody on that medication. But even after that point kind of passes, we oftentimes see that the decreased appetite goes on. So yeah, nausea is gonna make you want to eat less, but we see persistent decreased appetite going even above and beyond just that. So much so that these medications have actually already started to become developed and tested as standalone weight loss medications for people with obesity, even outside of diabetes. Victoza is already available in a higher dose form called Saxenda. It's the same medication, but Saxenda is intended to be used for non-diabetic people who just need to lose weight. And even if they don't live their whole life miserable in nausea, people tend to lose weight really nicely. Ozempic is also being developed for weight loss in the same way. That's still in clinical trials, so we don't know what that's going to be called. And I haven't seen the study specifically, but I believe that Trulicity is also being studied for weight loss purposes as well. So if it was just nausea, you wouldn't really see much utility in GLP-1 medications for the purposes of helping people lose weight even outside of diabetes, because nobody's going to want to live their entire life with nausea. Okay, the second part of the question is, are the weight loss effects long-term, or would they go away after somebody stops the medication? So that makes sense, right? So if you're taking a medication and it's helping you to lose weight, what happens when you stop that medication? So here's the deal with that. When it comes to weight loss, the decreased appetite that you're going to get with these medications, that is only going to last as long as you take the medication. If you stop the medication, yeah, the decreased appetite goes away. What happens with the weight, though, it's kind of up to the person. If a person is relying entirely on a medication, whether it's a GLP-1 medication or like an older weight loss medication like phentermine, you're going to get decreased appetite, and that can help you to lose weight. But if that's all there is behind your weight loss plan, then that's all there is. And once that medication stops, the goodbye decreased appetite, and it allows you to go back to everything that caused a person to gain weight in the beginning. So if the diet's not strong and if the person's not exercising and just living a healthy lifestyle that would be conducive to losing weight anyway, then it's a good chance that the weight is going to come back. However, if you have used the medication to control the blood sugar and to gain the benefits of the weight loss and diet assistance, but also enacted meaningful lifestyle changes, diet changes, and are just living a healthy lifestyle that is going to allow you to keep that weight off after stopping the medication, then you don't have to expect that the weight is automatically going to come back on, because what really helped that person to lose the weight in the first place is the decreased calorie intake, and we just need to continue that in order to maintain the weight afterwards. So in that regard, it's pretty much just like any other weight loss medication. All right, next question comes from Kevin, and it also has to do with side effects, believe it or not. So just to summarize the question, he mentions that Ozempic had been working really great for the blood sugar management and weight loss, but a couple days out of the month, there's a bunch of like belching and nausea and some other GI symptoms, and he's wondering if there's any particular type of food that might be causing it to happen, and if there's anything that people can do to try to at least minimize, if not eliminate, those side effects altogether. So some generalized tips as far as what somebody can do to try to see how they can try to minimize their specific side effects. When it comes to GLP-1 medications and the belching and the nausea and just the upset stomach that tends to come with them, step one is always try to reduce meal size. This medication is meant to cause you to eat less, and oftentimes we build our meals based on what we're just used to being familiar and what a plate of food ought to look like. Realistically, we oftentimes eat more than we really should anyway, and there's a little bit of relearning that oftentimes has to happen in terms of getting used to what a smaller meal would look like and changing our expectations about how much food is what we ought to be eating. Some of the side effects that you mentioned also tend to happen in people who have acid reflux. If there's pre-existing acid reflux like heartburn, GLP-1 medications can definitely make those symptoms more noticeable. So certain things that tend to bother that condition are things like fried, greasy, fatty foods, spicy foods, alcohol. So limiting those types of foods can sometimes be helpful. Outside of just the acid reflux part of this, several patients have told me that when they eat starchy foods that are higher in carbohydrates while taking GLP-1 medications, they tend to notice that their symptoms are a little bit more bothersome when eating those foods. And realistically, those are kind of the foods that we ought to be avoiding as type 2 diabetics anyway. So that's not necessarily a bad thing in my opinion, because if it's motivating toward leaning away from the foods that ought to be avoided, maybe that's a bonus. It doesn't feel good, but realistically, limiting those carbohydrates is not a bad thing in type 2 diabetes. All right, our next question comes from Liesel, and she wants to know, do any of these medications work for type 1 or type 1.5 diabetics? And I love this question because this is really interesting. So just to clarify, type 1 diabetes is when a person doesn't have enough insulin, their pancreas isn't functioning. Type 1.5 is the same kind of thing, only it's more slow onset, and it happens more commonly in older adults than like kids, teenagers, and young adults. It's effectively the same process, but it's a little bit more gradual in terms of how slowly the pancreas stops making insulin. If you want to know more about type 1.5 or LADA as it's more commonly referred to, I made a whole video on that. You can click here if you want to see that. It'll explain in detail what LADA is and how it works. So to answer your question on this, in type 1.5 in LADA, yes, GLP-1 medications are actually some of the preferred medications that we use earlier on in the course where there's still some pancreas function, because it'll oftentimes allow a person to go several years before they actually have to start insulin. Now, as I mentioned in that LADA video, somebody with diabetes 1.5 is going to need insulin eventually, and that's kind of inevitable, and it's important to recognize when that is the right time to start insulin. But in the meantime, in that early course of the disease, while the pancreas is still functional, GLP-1 medications are great because they will help to keep the pancreas cells healthier, keep them producing insulin, and allow somebody's blood sugar to be maintained and delay how long it takes before insulin becomes necessary. Okay. Now, After the beta cells in the pancreas lose functionality and the person is no longer able to make their own insulin anymore, they're basically a regular old type 1 diabetic. So the GLP-1 medication at that point is going to lose a lot of its effectiveness and they're going to require insulin. After that point, whether it's a progressed LADA patient who's fully insulin dependent, or if we're talking about like a straight up traditional type 1 diabetic, use of GLP-1 medications is a little bit debatable, but we do it sometimes, okay? So it's completely off-label and we have to be really careful about how we do it because the patient has to have an understanding of what that medication is and what its utility is in managing their blood glucose. These are injected medications and some of them are even injected every day, so it's really, really important that somebody understands that this is not insulin. And in full type 1 diabetes or progressed diabetes 1.5 or LADA, this is not a substitute for insulin. In early LADA, we use it instead of insulin, but if somebody is insulin dependent, it's really, really important that they have a full understanding that they still have to use their insulin. They cannot rely just on the GLP-1 medication because if they do, it's just DKA waiting to happen. So we sometimes will use it when people have wild fluctuations in their blood glucose. If somebody is what we might otherwise describe as a brittle diabetic, I've personally had some anecdotal success in getting a little bit more stability and predictability in people's blood glucose by adding some GLP-1 medication to the mix. They still have to use their insulin, they still have to carb count, they still have to bolus, but it's oftentimes helpful in getting a little bit more flattening of the wild fluctuations. And it doesn't work for everybody. Anytime we use a GLP-1 medication in somebody who's type 1, it's kind of an experiment just to see how they do. And sometimes we just stop it because it just doesn't work. But it's been studied and a lot of endocrinologists will use it from time to time in their type 1 diabetics so long as everybody has a full understanding of what its role is in managing that person's blood glucose. But the effect of it has not been consistent enough or robust enough to get the FDA to approve it for widespread use in type 1 diabetics. Okay, next question comes from CLH42. I'm guessing that's not your actual name, but CLH42 says that Ozempic was working awesome at first, but eventually the effects on both the blood sugar control and the weight loss began to wear off, and they're wondering what might be the cause of that. Okay, so it's hard to say what specifically might be causing a medication to be less effective in one individual without really being able to fully evaluate you and know your specific circumstances. But in general terms of what might cause a medication to become less effective, diabetes is a progressive disease and it tends to worsen with time. Any medication that we use, if we're relying on it exclusively, type 2 diabetes just tends to get worse as time goes by. So depending on where you are in the course of the disease, if you're still early in type 2 diabetes and you still have good pancreas function and you're making plenty of insulin, these medications can be really effective. As time goes by, in type 2 diabetics, we tend to see a gradual loss of insulin producing function in the pancreas. And if we're further along, it may be a short amount of time before medications become less effective. In terms of finding out what might be causing a person's medication to become less effective as time goes by, step one is to do an honest self-assessment of diet and lifestyle. If you're following a really strong diabetes, low carb diet, and you have an active lifestyle and you're working on weight loss and just improving your general metabolism to allow your body to handle its own glucose naturally, that's a great thing and you should keep doing that. But if there's room for improvement in the diet and the lifestyle, and there's things that we can cut out and there's things that we can do better in terms of activity, that's going to be more meaningful than jumping to another medication and not addressing the core things in the diet and lifestyle that are going to allow you to maintain better glucose control. If you've already got that solid diet and your activity's great and you're like, I'm doing everything I can, I honestly can say that my diet is where it should be, but the medications are still becoming less effective, you might want to have a conversation with your healthcare provider about that very question, because there's testing that we can do in order to see how well your pancreas is still making insulin. And if we're further along in the course of diabetes and we're starting to lose that pancreas functionality, that's something that we need to know about, because yeah, any medication is going to start to lose effectiveness if you're not making enough insulin anymore. All right, our last question today comes from Kay, and she's wondering about starting multiple medications at the same time or close together and whether that's a good idea. She mentions that she was recently started on metformin, and since some of the side effects of metformin and GLP-1 medications overlap, kind of like nausea and upset stomach, should she go ahead and start the Trulicity that she was prescribed at the same time as the metformin, or would it be better to spread them out a little bit? So I'm going to generalize this one as well, because I don't want to specifically say what one person should or shouldn't do without knowing their circumstances or it being my patient and I'm responsible personally for the healthcare. But just in general, it's common to start multiple medications at the same time depending on how high your A1C is. And that's consistent with the American Diabetes Association and American Academy of Clinical Endocrinologists guidelines. For a certain A1C starting point, we kind of know that if your A1C to start is 11, it's probably unlikely that one medication alone is going to get you to goal. Usually metformin is the starting medication, but after a certain point, once your A1C is high enough, starting with 2 medications at the same time is kind of consistent with the guidelines, because no one medication is going to get you there by itself. Okay. Now, some people can accomplish it with really meaningful dietary improvements, and that's amazing. But unfortunately, most people aren't going to do that right off the bat, and I wish they would, but it's just real life that they don't. So we commonly start more than one medication at a time. That being said, diabetes is a marathon disease, not a sprint disease. So I'm usually not mad if a patient wants to kind of spread them out a little bit. If you want to give a few weeks of the metformin first, just to kind of get used to it, see how you do, and then add on your second medication after a few weeks or even a month or so, I'm usually okay with the patient doing that, because realistically, if it was critical that a patient started both of those medications at the same time and it had to be today, I probably would have given that patient insulin instead of something milder like metformin and a GLP-1. Maybe I still would have given those things too. But if I'm only giving metformin and a GLP-1, or metformin and something like Farxiga or Jardiance or something like that, that would imply probably that their situation's not so critical that they absolutely must start both of those medications right away. A couple of weeks probably isn't going to make that big of a difference, and for most of my patients, I'm fine with that. Because I mean, look, if you get a side effect from a medication and you started both of them at the same time, how do you know which med to point the finger at? And we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater if we have to change a medication. So pacing it out a little bit is not really a bad idea. Talk to your doctor about it specifically if you're concerned, but for most patients, it ain't that big of a deal. All right, so that's going to wrap up this edition of Sugar High Answering Your Questions. I really appreciate you guys posting these questions and interacting with me through the comment section. It's been so fun since I've started posting these videos to see how everybody's responding to the information. And I'm glad that people seem to be learning as we go. And I'm really looking forward to future interactions with you guys. So if there's anything that you guys want to know, if there's questions that still stand out, topics that you want covered in future videos, hit me up in the comment section below and I will do my best to get everything covered. Have a great rest of the week, guys, and I will see you soon in the next video.